The radio on his belt crackled with routine calls about shoplifters and parking disputes, but Detective Frank McCallister had once listened for reports of homicides, armed robberies, and cases that kept him awake for weeks. Frank, 68, sat in the back row of the Tonight Show studio, his sharp eyes automatically scanning exits and assessing potential threats, habits ingrained from 30 years as one of Chicago PD's most decorated detectives, followed by 20 years as a shopping mall security guard in suburban New Jersey. The small Meadowbrook Mall security badge on his navy uniform shirt caught the studio lights as he shifted in his seat. To the thousands of shoppers who passed him daily, Frank was just another friendly security guard who helped find lost children and directed people to the food court. But what they didn't know was that they were being watched over by a man who had solved 127 homicide cases, taken down 3 major crime families, and spent 3 decades protecting Chicago from its most dangerous criminals. What Frank didn't know was that his story had reached the attention of true crime enthusiasts and retired law enforcement officers who had begun sharing legends about the mall cop who used to be a legend. Someone had posted an old newspaper clipping about Detective McCallister's most famous case, the Riverside Strangler, alongside a recent photo of him helping an elderly woman find her car in the Meadowbrook Mall parking lot. Frank's story had begun with a calling to serve and protect. Born in Irish Catholic Chicago, he joined the police force in 1974 straight out of college, driven by a simple desire to make his neighborhood safer. But Frank had possessed something rare, an almost supernatural ability to see patterns others missed, to connect seemingly unrelated details, to think like the criminals he pursued while never losing his moral compass. By the 9,980s, Detective McCallister had become a legend in the Chicago PD. He had solved cases that had baffled other detectives for years, including the notorious Riverside Strangler case that had terrorized the city for 18 months. Frank's breakthrough came not from forensic evidence, but from noticing that the killer always struck during Cubs home games, using the crowds and traffic as cover for his escapes. And when the Cubs storm shuttle split his front row, McCallister killed the audience and people contestants in the Cubs. Over 30 years, Frank had worked everything from domestic disputes to organized crime, gang violence to white-collar fraud. He'd testified in hundreds of trials, saved countless lives, and earned the respect of criminals and colleagues alike. The joke around the precinct was that Frank McCallister could solve a case by looking at the crime scene for 5 minutes and asking 3 questions. But 2004 had changed everything. During a raid on a drug house, Frank had been shot 3 times, leaving him with permanent nerve damage in his right arm and chronic pain that made the physical demands of police work impossible. At 58, after 30 years of service, he'd been forced into medical retirement, his detective career ending not with fanfare, but with disability paperwork and physical therapy sessions. That's when he'd discovered Meadowbrook Mall. The security job paid a fraction of his detective salary, but it came with health benefits and the chance to help people in small ways. Frank had moved to New Jersey to be closer to his daughter's family, taking the mall security position as temporary work while he figured out what retired detectives do with themselves. But 20 years had passed, and Frank had found unexpected purpose in his new role. The skills that had made him a great detective, observation, pattern recognition, understanding human behavior, served him well in preventing shoplifting, de-escalating disputes, and keeping families safe. He'd caught dozens of thieves, prevented several assaults, and even helped solve a missing person case when he noticed suspicious behavior in the parking lot. The Tonight Show tickets had been a retirement gift from mall management. After 20 years of exemplary service, Frank was finally stepping down at 68. What was supposed to be a quiet recognition ceremony had somehow led to national television, though Frank still wasn't sure how or why. It was a Thursday night taping in January, and Jimmy was in good spirits after interviewing an action star about his new thriller. During his commercial break interaction with the audience, his attention was drawn to Frank by his perfect posture and the way he continuously scanned the room with trained, observant eyes. You look like someone who doesn't miss much. What do you do for work?" Frank straightened with the automatic authority of someone accustomed to command situations. "Security guard at Meadowbrook Mall in New Jersey. Been there 20 years, just retired this week." A warm murmur went through the nearby audience members. 20 years of keeping shoppers safe seemed like honest, dedicated work. 20 years in mall security, that must give you some interesting stories about human behavior. Frank's eyes lit up slightly. Talking about human behavior was something he'd always enjoyed. Oh, yes, you learn to read people very quickly in that job. Someone acting nervous near the electronics might be planning to steal. A person asking too many questions about store security might be casing the place. You develop instincts about who belongs and who. It sounds like you really understand criminal behavior. Well, you pick it up over time. Petty theft mostly, occasional domestic disputes in the parking lot. Nothing too serious, thankfully. Jimmy noticed something in Frank's tone, a casual familiarity with criminal behavior that seemed to go beyond typical mall security experience. Frank, have you always worked in security? Frank paused, as if deciding how much of his past to reveal. No, not always. I had a different kind of career before the mall. What kind of career? I was a police officer. Detective, actually. Worked homicide in Chicago for 30 years before I had to retire. The casual way he mentioned homicide caused a ripple through the nearby audience members. Homicide detectives weren't ordinary cops. They were the elite investigators who solved murders. Jimmy's interest was immediately piqued. This wasn't just a career change story. This was someone who had gone from investigating the most serious crimes to monitoring shopping mall food courts. Jimmy made a decision that would change everything. Reg Homicide Detective is a pretty serious job. Would you mind coming down here and telling us about that career? Frank looked uncertain. Oh, I don't think people want to hear old war stories from Chicago. Trust me, I think they do. Come on down. As Frank made his way to the stage with the measured stride of someone who'd walked into countless dangerous situations, his bearing transformed completely, the confident presence of a man who'd once commanded crime scenes and interrogation rooms. When he reached the stage, Jimmy guided him to a comfortable chair. Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy announced, this is Detective Frank McCallister. Sorry, former Detective McCallister. For 30 years, he's solved homicides in Chicago, and for the last 20 years, he's been keeping shoppers safe at a New Jersey mall. Frank, tell us about your detective career. Frank settled into the chair, and suddenly he was back in his element. Discussing investigations was something he'd done for 3 decades. I started as a beat cop in 1974, worked my way up to detective by 1980, spent most of my career in homicide, solved quite a few cases over the years. Chicago was a tough city in those days, gangs, organized crime, all sorts of violence that needed investigating. How many cases did you solve? Frank looked modest. Official count was 127 homicides cleared, plus dozens of other major crimes. But it wasn't just me. Good detective work is always a team effort. The studio fell silent. 127 solved murders represented thousands of hours of investigation, hundreds of families who got justice, countless criminals taken off the streets. Commercial, 127 murders, Frank? That's incredible. Did you have a specialty? Pattern recognition, mostly. I was good at seeing connections between seemingly unrelated cases. Sometimes killers develop habits, signatures, ways of operating that they don't realize they're repeating. If you can spot the pattern, you can predict where they'll strike next. Can you tell us about your most famous case? Frank's expression grew more serious. The Riverside Strangler case, 1987 to 1989. Serial killer who had the whole city terrified. He'd killed 8 women over 18 months, and we had no solid leads. Every detective in the department was working the case. The audience was completely quiet, drawn into Frank's methodical recounting of real police work. What was your breakthrough? I noticed something everyone else had missed. All 8 murders happened on nights when the Cubs were playing at home. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Cubs play a lot of home games. But then I realized the killer was using the crowds leaving Wrigley Field as cover. Thousands of people, lots of traffic, perfect way to blend in and disappear. Jimmy leaned forward. So what did you do? We set up surveillance around Wrigley during the next home game. Sure enough, spotted our suspect stalking a potential victim in the crowd. Arrested him before he could strike again. Turned out he worked at a hot dog stand outside the stadium. Had been watching potential victims for weeks during games, then following them home. The studio was mesmerized by Frank's matter-of-fact recounting of stopping a serial killer. That must have felt incredible, solving a case that had stumped everyone. It felt like doing my job, Frank said simply. That's what detectives do. We keep looking until we find the answer. Every victim deserves justice. Every family deserves closure. Jimmy reached behind his chair and pulled out a tablet. Frank, we did some research before tonight. We found articles about you from your Chicago days. He showed Frank a Chicago Tribune headline from 1989, Detective McCallister cracks Riverside Strangler case. This article calls you one of Chicago PD's finest investigators and says your work on this case likely saved dozens of lives. Frank looked stunned. You found that old article? We did, and we reached out to some people from your past. Listen to this, from Captain Rodriguez, your former commanding officer. Frank McCallister was the best detective I ever worked with. He had an instinct for patterns and human behavior that bordered on supernatural. Chicago lost one of its greatest when he had to retire. Jimmy continued, from the family of one of the Riverside Strangler victims, Detective McCallister didn't just solve our daughter's case, he treated our family with dignity during the worst time of our lives. He promised us justice, and he delivered. Frank's eyes filled with tears. I remember that family. Sweet girl studying to be a teacher. Frank, how do you go from solving murders to working mall security? That must have been a difficult transition. I was shot during a drug raid in 2004. Nerve damage ended my detective career at 58. I had to find something else to do with myself. The mall security job was supposed to be temporary, but Frank smiled slightly. You know, it turns out the skills that make you a good detective also make you good at spotting shoplifters. Have you ever used your detective skills at the mall? More than you'd think. Last year, I noticed a man hanging around the children's play area taking photos. Something felt wrong. His behavior, his positioning, the way he interacted with parents. Turned out he was a registered sex offender, violating his parole terms. My observation helped get him arrested before he could harm anyone. Jimmy stood and addressed the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, this man spent 30 years protecting Chicago from its most dangerous criminals, then spent 20 years protecting New Jersey families during their shopping trips. He's shown that a guardian is a guardian, whether you're carrying a detective's badge or a security radio. He turned back to Frank. The law enforcement community wants to honor you. There's going to be a ceremony for retired detectives who've made significant contributions to public safety. Will you attend? Frank nodded, overwhelmed, for the families of the victims. They deserve to be remembered. There's something else, Jimmy continued. Some of your former colleagues have created the McCallister method, a training program for young detectives based on your pattern recognition techniques. They want you to help teach the next generation. Frank sat in stunned silence. They want me to teach? The maid do. Because, Frank, what you've done, protecting people at every level, from stopping serial killers to helping lost children find their parents, that's a lifetime of service that deserves recognition. As they helped Frank back to his seat, he stopped and looked out at the audience one more time. Thank you, but I want everyone to know every day there are people working to keep you safe. Police officers, security guards, detectives, all kinds of folks who make it their job to watch out for others. Don't take that protection for granted. The episode that aired became one of the most watched Tonight Show segments of the year, sparking conversations about the transition from law enforcement to civilian careers and the value of experienced officers sharing their knowledge. Frank's story inspired dozens of retired detectives to reach out, many sharing similar experiences of using their investigative skills in unexpected second careers. The McCallister method became a real training program, teaching young officers the pattern recognition techniques that had made Frank legendary. Frank spent his retirement consulting on cold cases and teaching at police academies, discovering that leaving active duty didn't mean leaving law enforcement. It meant sharing his expertise to create better investigators for the future. At 70, Frank still observes everything with a detective's eyes, still believes in justice for victims and their families, and still carries his old detective shield in his wallet, a reminder that once you dedicate your life to protecting others, that calling never really ends. Because sometimes the most important guardians are the ones you never notice, watching from the shadows, using a lifetime of experience to keep ordinary people safe from extraordinary dangers, whether in city streets or shopping mall corridors.